Hey guys, Loremaster of Sotek here, and it's time for another day of the Ogre Kingdom's Q&A. That technically rhymed, but it wasn't intentional. In any event, we're just going to hop straight into it today. I do want to give a reminder that today is Friday, so there will not be a Ogre Kingdoms video tomorrow or Sunday. They will resume at 7 a.m. on Monday morning. And the reason for that is because I need to sort through some more questions, so it just kind of gives me time to do that without me having to risk catching up with myself. So we're only going to do weekdays for the Q&A stuff, but there will be other stuff to watch tomorrow. Our first question for today comes from Lucas Schuler. He asks, what are the ogres' views on the Yetis? All I know of them is that they are cousins of the ogres and will occasionally aid them in battle. So the ogres and the Yetis are distantly related. Cousins, I guess, is a word you could use for it, but by the modern standards of Warhammer Fantasy, they kind of split off in an evolutionary chain, but they come from the same common ancestor of the older ogres. When the ogre kingdoms were destroyed, the original ones were destroyed by the Great Maw, and the ogres started to flee west, a number of them tried to settle the lands immediately west of the ogre homeland, which is a big old set of mountains known as the ancient, the ancient giant lands, I think it's what it's called. Yeah, the ancient giant lands, which are a big old mountain range that have some of the highest peaks in the world. And that's actually where the Sky Titans lived. Of course, the Sky Titans were the most colossal beings in the existence of Warhammer Fantasy. They were this super advanced race of titanic creatures, but they lived very, very isolated from one another, and they valued their privacy. So the ogres kind of were like a never-ending swarm of piranhas that managed to overwhelm and pretty much wipe them all out. However, the reason the ogres didn't stay there is because when they went up into the peaks, it wasn't just a hostile, cold environment like the Mountains of Morn. It was actually worse. And the reason for that is when the Great Maw impacted the planet, of course being made almost entirely out of warpstone, it cast up these massive, like, dust storms. I don't know if you've ever seen a dust storm on our planet. They are not fun. I've lived through many of them when I went to school out in West Texas, and it's insane. But in the ancient giant lands, these weren't just dust storms, they were storms of warpstone dust. So it was basically these colossal magical storms that just slammed into the peaks where it was like really, really windy in the upper atmosphere where all that dust got thrown up due to the impact. And the ogres many of the ogres realized something was weird, because it basically made the sky shine like a bunch of bizarre colors, and they could feel the effect on themselves. It wasn't like painful, it was just odd. Most of the ogre kingdoms decided, okay, we don't want to stay here, this isn't safe, we don't know what this is, we don't understand it, we're going to keep moving west. So they did. And those went on to found the regular ogre kingdoms. But the ogres who stayed behind and up in the peaks ended up being mutated by the just substantial amounts of warpstone in the atmosphere. And over time, it caused them to adapt to their environment in an extreme. So they grew really, really long claws, they grew long fur, their skin color changed to more of like a bluish hue, and they gained supernatural ice abilities. The Yetis in Warhammer literally exude an aura of frost, so that everything around them is always like being dragged below zero. It's a really weird, but powerful magic effect. And however, despite the two races splitting off so long ago, this was thousands and thousands of years ago, the Yetis and the ogres have actually remained very close as far as two different species can. They don't talk to one another, but the Yetis basically still view the ogres and vice versa as like true allies. and there is a sense of camaraderie and kind of an unspoken pact that if one of them summons the other, they are obligated to respond. Now, the Yetis, to my knowledge, have never attempted to call the ogres for aid. They tend to show up when the ogres need them and just kind of mind their own business otherwise. But every single ogre tribe, at least the decently sized ones, will have a tyrant. And the tyrants have the authority to sound what's called a great horn. And a great horn is literally like this massive bestial horn that is carved out of a really large type of ice mammoth, like these big, colossal, frozen blizzard creatures. Kind of like the Thunder Tusk, which this is the Thunder Tusk right behind me. They're very similar to these. But it might actually just be a really big Thunder Tusk. But in any event, when you carve a horn out of that, if an ogre tyrant sounds the horn, which is called the Great Horn, it will guarantee summon a large contingent of Yetis to help them fight. So the Yetis will just come swarming down from the mountains to help out. And so the two races do have a very friendly relationship. I wouldn't call them friends. They're more of just extreme allies, I guess would be the best way to look at it. Next up, we've got W. Stanish. Where do ogres fit in the old and new worlds, if at all? Technically, ogres can show up literally anywhere, because being a true neutral race, they are willing to work with literally anybody, and they're also the #1 mercenary race, in that if you are looking to hire mercenaries, ogres are probably going to be involved somehow. Because all they care about is food and gold, so they're really, really easy to bribe into being moderately faithful as long as you take care of them and offer them more than your enemy would. That being said, if you're looking for the actual proper ogre kingdoms, you will only find them in the Mountains of Morn. So basically, if you're looking for a society of ogres, that's only going to be in the far east of the Mountains of Morn, and that's it. You're not going to find ogre tribes anywhere else in the world. You might find a tribe wandering around who's on the path of conquest, but you're not going to find them settling down and making a camp and all that crazy stuff. You're actually more likely to find Yetis in more places in the world, as like having settled down and making homes in the very, very high peaks of the world, than you are to find ogres. That being said, there is no continent, with the exception of the southern continent, the Antarctic, or the Warhammer equivalent to Antarctica, where you will not find ogres. You're going to find ogres in Lustra, you're going to find ogres in Nagaroth, you're going to find ogres in the Old World, and the Southlands, and Nehekara, and Araby, the Empire, Bretonia, Albion probably, just because they wander everywhere. They go wherever they feel like, and they really enjoy exploring the world, and they will work for anybody. So oftentimes, if someone is a group of explorers, 99% of the time they're going to have some kind of ogre bodyguard. Either he's going to be the guy protecting the paymaster, or he is just going to be like the big bouncer that protects them from the really, really scary stuff, or at least tries to discourage scary stuff from thinking they're an easy mark. Next up, we've got E.A. Diaz. Are all ogre butchers inherently magical? Yes. Ogres, when ogres are born, the butchers and slaughtermasters of the tribe are able to tell if the newborn babes are going to have the ability to use magic. They usually will get some kind of portent, so they might be looking for some kind of birthmark, or maybe they're looking for some kind of weird deformity on the baby, or there might be some notable sign going on, like a bird pattern or some event, but there will be something that clues them in to the fact that the baby possesses the ability to cast magic. And whenever that happens, the baby is always immediately handed over to the tribe's butcher or slaughtermaster, whoever's the highest ranking one. Immediate. And it's not a big deal. The ogres don't lose sleep over it or anything. They're just like, boom, done. And what will happen at that point is if the baby is... the way they become a butcher or a slaughtermaster is that, as gruesome as this is, the butcher in question will take the baby and he will just take a big honkin' bite, like a full mouthful chunk out of its stomach, which thankfully ogre babies are quite large, so it's probably horribly painful, but he basically takes a massive bite out of them, and then they force feed the baby like raw meats and other kinds of Ma-approved food, stuff that would probably kill a human, until it basically gets really fat and just kind of regenerates all the damage that was done to it. And once they've finished regenerating the wound in their stomach, they're basically officially ready to start training. And to train, they will focus on feeding them a lot of poisons and just a lot of different kinds of ingredients. The reason they stock them up on poisons is so that the butchers are able to eat anything without fear of suffering negative effects. But that also has the bonus that Ogre Butchers and Slaughtermasters, fun fact, are completely immune to all forms of poison in Warhammer Fantasy. You cannot poison a butcher. It's impossible. Even if you have the deadliest Skaven venom or the nastiest Dark Elf concoction, it's not going to work. It would have to be something like beyond supernatural to kill an Ogre Butcher or a Slaughtermaster, because they just build up absurd tolerances to even the scariest stuff. But yeah, they're handed off at birth. Fire bellies are a little bit more of a cultural phenomena. Fire bellies are more akin to ogres that basically witness the fire mouth or an experience like a massive eruption or an earthquake or something, and they feel a call that pulls them to it. But fire bellies are kind of a unique thing because they're their own little religious cult, and of course they're the only ogre group that feel the call of the wind of fire, Akshi. Whereas the Butchers and Slaughtermasters, they can wield the Lore of the Great Maw, obviously, if they're more of a priestly role. But even outside of that, they might not feel the call of the Maw specifically. They might instead feel a call of a certain aspect of nature that the ogres observe. So the other lores that the ogres have an innate connection with and Butchers and Slaughtermasters can end up learning or growing into are the lore of death, Shaish, the lore of heavens, which is Azir, and the lore of, I want to say, beasts? Not 100% sure on that one. I'd have to double check. I think it's beasts. It's either beasts or shadow. Pretty sure it's not. No, definitely not shadow. Let's see. Heavens. Because there's 4 of them. What are my other options? Metal? No. Beast? Probably. Shadow? No. Light? Definitely not. Life? Definitely not. Whatever. I'll look it up later and put it in the top comment, but I'm 99% sure it's the Lore of Beasts. In any event, that should answer... Oh, that's only the first part of your question. Second part of your question is, how can an ogre starve when it said that they can eat anything, including rocks and wood, or do they specifically need meat? This is actually fairly straightforward, in that the problem with ogres is the sheer amount of sustenance they require to stay healthy is absurd. And I mean, if you think about how big they are, these are 9-foot plus tall behemoths at least, weighing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Some in the probably thousands of pounds category. There are human beings that exist, who are upwards of 500 pounds. So there's no doubt that the likes of Grease's Goldtooth are well over 4 digits. But the ogres, they need a lot of energy to move and stay healthy and be able to operate in their society. There is no fate, well, there's very few fates worse for an ogre than starving to death. Especially because if ogres don't eat enough, they tend to turn into really, really scary monsters called gorgers, which we'll talk about later. But although ogres can digest anything, there's a trick to that, in that ogres cannot pull sustenance from anything. They can get away with eating rocks or plants or wood, but eating trees and boulders isn't going to actually give them any calories. It isn't going to give their body any energy to work with. They have a supernatural digestive system in that their stomachs are made of some magical substance that can handle absurd things if they train for it, I should note. Ogres cannot casually walk up to lava and just drink it. That would kill them. But the average ogre. Fire bellies have to train for a really long time, and they build up by eating like super duper spicy things, and then they start eating like actual on fire things, and they eventually, at the true zenith of their art, they're able to eat lava directly. But and it's like a huge ritual for them. That is not guaranteed to go well. I want to say it's a 50-50 shot if Fire Belly can successfully consume lava from the fire mouth and survive. Like there's a very, very high chance they'll die in the process. So it's not necessarily that ogres can eat anything. It's just that the things they would try to eat, they usually can handle. But ogres aren't idiots. They're not terribly brilliant, but they're not trolls. Trolls are literally a creature that will just eat anything. But trolls can survive eating anything because of their regeneration, and they start to take on like physical traits of whatever it is they're living in. Stone trolls are literally trolls that have eaten so many rocks that has become their primary diet. And that's fine with them, and they literally develop rock-like features in that they have like a really supernaturally tough hide that's just as hard as stone and makes them basically heavily armored. And because they're so full of, they've become so synonymous with the earth itself, they're able to ground magic, so it gives them notable magic resistance. Ogres cannot do that. Ogres do not adapt physically to their surroundings at a fundamental level. They adapt culturally to their surroundings, but if you put an ogre in a really hot environment or a place where there was no genuine food to eat, so there was no notable plants that they could make crops or something out of, there was no meat, there was no game for them to hunt, they would die. They would just die out really, really fast. And that's a big reason why the Ogre Kingdom's it was a hard conversation for the ogres to really consider leaving the Mountains of Morn and going further west. And the reason for that is they stopped in the Mountains of Morn, not because they were lazy or anything, but because the megafauna in the Ogre Kingdoms, the environment was deadly enough that it kept their population kind of under control, and the megafauna that were there, if you killed them, it would provide like a substantial amount of food for an ogre tribe. Whereas if they were to come far west, they would have to resort to eating humans and orcs and like anything they could find, because there would not be the animal populations or size that they would need to sustain themselves. That's why ogres tend to leave the Mountains of Morn, go do a lot of crazy shit, and then come back. Because it's not sustainable for them to put down roots in most other places unless they could find a way to locate some new source of food, like if they found a reliable place where there were dragons or something, or other large beasties. Like if I could see ogres going after like a Ragnarok spiders. If they found like a big forest goblin forest, they could mess around with them and eat spiders. But hopefully that kind of answers that. The ogres do need to eat food, something with calories and some kind of sustenance in order to survive, or else they will starve. They do not have the ability to survive off of basically nothing, even though they could get away with eating it. Your next question is there anything ogres cannot eat? We kind of answered that. Just to kind of hit on it again, is that with enough preparation, no, I don't think there's anything ogres could not get away with eating. I would not at all be surprised if there have been chaos ogres that have just literally devoured pure warpstone, which is like the equivalent of walking into a nuclear reactor and just like picking up some super irradiated sandwich and just the actual plutonium rods themselves and just chowing down. So with enough time, and careful preparation, no, ogres can get away with anything. The average ogre does have limits. You know, if they try and eat lava, they're gonna die. If they try and eat something that's incredibly venomous, they're gonna die. If they try and eat something that, you know, there are certain kinds of squigs that tend to like explode into spines when, you know, heavily threatened, and they ate one of those, they would die. There are certainly things that can kill the average ogre, but it would have to be something pretty extreme. But they're not invulnerable. And then, okay, you got 2 more in your set. How do the giants in the greenskin armies feel about the ogre giants or ogres in general? Giants as a race are quite frankly very indifferent, or is ambivalent the right word? They don't really give a crap about anything smaller than themselves. And that includes ogres. You know, while ogres are very large to us, to giants, you know, they're notable. The only thing that ogres really have that's a unique relationship with giants is that when ogres attempt to get a giant to join them, it will go down. There are 3 possible ways it's going to go down. The first is that they will just flat out enslave the giant. When the Ogre Kingdoms were originally released back in 6th edition, their giants were specifically noted as being called slave giants. Like, it was a unique class of giant because the ogres could just bully them around. And that still happens. That being said, in 8th edition, they've kind of gone more to actually recruiting the giants, but they do still tend to do it by actually bullying them as opposed to begging or luring them like greenskins do. Giants are scared of ogres some of the time. Some giants are too stupid or too drunk or too belligerent to allow themselves to be bullied, in which case they will fight with the ogres, and who will win that is kind of a toss-up. In ogre culture, there are very, very few titles as revered and not worshipped, but appreciated by other ogres as, you know, being a giant breaker or some synonym along those lines. Killing a giant is a huge deal in ogre culture, to the extent that when ogre tyrants barter with giants to try and recruit them, there's a total coin flip chance that the ogre tyrant is just going to give in to that inner desire to fight a giant and just totally screw up the negotiations and fight it, just because he wants to try and prove that he deserves that title. You know, killing a giant is so synonymous with ogres. To them, it's just the perfect challenge, and it has a big callback to their greatest accomplishment, which was, of course, killing the Sky Titans. Which, speaking of which, it is famously known that if a tyrant is better at negotiation than they are at outright violence, they will often recite tales of what they did to the Sky Titans. Granted, very, very embellished tales that are like, you know, have been handed down and have gotten bigger and nastier with every retelling over 5,000-6,000 years. Or sorry, more like 3,000 or 4,000 years. But they'll tell the giants how they basically brutally killed, tortured, and devoured their ancestors, and the giants will be like, fine, geez, I'll help, just shut up, like, stop. You know, it'd be like if somebody murdered your parents and then they showed up to your house and they were like, hey, I need you to help me on this secret mission. You're like, no. And they're like, okay, here's what I'm gonna do to you if you don't, and the story I'm gonna tell to you is what I did to your parents. And you're just like, Jesus. Like, I don't want that to happen to me, but that's also a super messed up way to get my help. But anyway, as far as how greenskin giants would feel about other giants, most giants are not super fond of each other. Their race has degenerated to such an extent that if 2 giants are in the same area, they are probably going to be competing for resources, and it's probably going to turn into a really, really ugly fight. unless, of course, it was a male and female giant, in which case you would have other problems. But it for the most part, I would not say that there is an exceptional relationship between any of the different giant species. I think the biggest ones I could think of is the Chaos Siege giants would probably have a very unique relationship with all the other giants, but that's because they have literally been like tortured and mutilated into something almost entirely unrecognizable. So other giants would probably see them as like a pretty degenerative creation and try and put them down. But as far as ogre giants, I think maybe you might see, if it was like a actual slave giant, which the old slave giants used to have like collars and brands and all this stuff that their ogre tribes would give them to basically mark them as property, there might be some form of empathy or sympathy between the two, but I can't say for sure. Giants are so notoriously smashed all the time, like they're just drunk perpetually if they can manage it, because they're just always in agony. Like they're a really, really sad species, genuinely sad, heartbreaking story, and I just don't think they have the presence of mind to really give a crap about each other. But there you go. The last question from this good sir is, how much did the ogres change before and after the coming of the Great Maw? So that question, which kind of gets asked in different ways, is that about the ogres before the Great Maw. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of answers on that. We do have a pretty good idea that they didn't change a bunch. The biggest thing that changed about the ogres was that the Great Maw kind of took over their life, and it took their worst feature, their biggest flaw, and evolved it into something way worse. Which there is a very interesting set of truths about chaos and its influence on the Warhammer races, where basically it's revealed that every single Warhammer Fantasy race was slightly altered by the coming of chaos. The ogres, for whatever reason, avoided, probably because they're so chaos resistant, managed to avoid the first kind of tinkering of the Dark Gods, but when the Great Maw hit them, it messed them up. And what really happened to them is that the ogre culture shifted from being a nomadic culture, basically just focused on survival and propagation, to instead being a much darker culture that reflected the all-consuming nature of the Great Maw itself, and it turned the ogre's natural gluttony into something way more perverse, to the extent that ogre culture is so focused on greed and gluttony that it's insane. All ogres care about is consumption, just hoarding and devouring as much as they possibly can, and attaining the greatest size they possibly can, and just being absurd bullies and accomplishing that goal of feeding their hunger, no matter the cost or the suffering that it might inflict on others. And the big things that we saw after the Great Maw arrived were that, A, the ogres became exceptionally religious. Granted, from their perspective, their god literally hit them and almost made them go extinct. And their the first prophet of the ogres, Groth Onefinger, he literally went on a pilgrimage very, very soon after the Great Maw had impacted. He basically took a journey and wandered through the super duper dangerous wastelands surrounding the Great Maw, and he managed to walk all the way to the lip of the crater so he could actually look down at it. So he could actually, if you've seen the like Chernobyl TV series on, I think it's HBO, when they like look into the reactor, it was basically that scene, but instead of it being super duper horrific, it inspired a guy to make a religion. And he took his observations back to all the ogres, and they all felt that the Great Maw had changed them, those who had survived. You know, they went from being a race of a bunch of kind of fat dudes that but they would eat until they were full. Like, they had a limit. They had the ability to restrain themselves. But with the Great Maw, its influence on them literally made their hunger bottomless. Not to the extent that it tortures them, but basically to the extent that there is no such thing as a truly satisfied ogre. They will pursue wealth and gluttony like, you know, today's the last day on Earth and you might as well kick it while you have the chance. So hopefully that answers your last question there. And then we've got another set of questions here from Polex411. And this is going to be today's last question, just because there's a couple of them. So the first one is, how quickly do ogres reproduce? Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of knowledge on that. We don't have much, if any, notable data on ogre family units. In fact, the amount of female ogres present in Warhammer Fantasy is very, very itty bitty. You have to go look at some very specific lore stories or short stories to find female ogres. And you also, there was a single female ogre model, but I can't entirely recall if she was actually a female ogre or if it was a cross-dressing male ogre. I know that may sound like a weird thing to not be sure about, but the model, it's difficult to tell, and I remember there was definitely a definitive answer. I'm pretty sure it was a cross-dressing ogre, not actually a female ogre, but it was one of the man-eater variants. But we don't really know how quickly they reproduce, but it can be said that it must be very fast, or at least at a speed comparable to humans, because the ogre kingdoms were virtually wiped out about I want to say it was 2,000 or 3,000 years before Sigmar. I'd have to double check. You know what? I'm going to double check because I don't want somebody to accidentally miss out on some information. Let's see. When did the Great Maw impact? What page is it? Where's tribes? Here we go. Yeah, okay, so the Great Maw impacted 2750 before Sigmar. So the ogres have the ogres went from being virtually extinct to being of such a colossal, not colossal, but at least in the hundreds of thousands, if not low millions of population over the course of about 4,000 years, give or take. But that is with the 3.5. But that's with the inclusion of the fact that they are purely a might makes right culture, and they have a survival of the fittest mentality that is so extreme that if you are born and if you're born to an ogre family or tribe and you are sickly, or you're not big enough, or you have some kind of deformity, or, you know, you're just not ideal, you're dead. Best case scenario, they will basically chuck you into a cave and you will learn to survive, or you're dead. And if you learn to survive, you turn into a horrifying monster that would easily mainline as a good horror movie villain called a Gorger, which are ogres without fat, and it is much, much scarier and worse than a regular ogre. Gorgers are they are very uncomfortable creatures to look at and to think about. But so considering how much of their own population is culled by constant violence, the deadly environment they live in, you know, constant battles, infighting between the tribes, and of course just having that culture that only the strongest will survive, they must reproduce fairly quick. I would not be surprised if their family units are very large. We do know that there is no such thing, or at least very rare, for ogres to not have multiple siblings. You know, Grease's Goldtooth was noted as being the most active, or the most powerful and ambitious of his brothers. But he had like a good handful of brothers, but he was the one, of course, who killed and devoured his own father. That being said, if I had to guess at ogre family units, though there is one short story I would probably want to double check before I said this for sure. If I recall correctly, ogres have the system where there are female ogres in a tribe, and they all mate, I believe, with the tyrant, or at the very least the bruisers, and they're like the dads. Period, end of story. Until either they are killed in battle, or they get too old and frail and end up being killed and eaten by one of their sons. So there you go. Next part is, you mentioned that most of the organs of an ogre is in their gut area. Does that include things like their brains? No, not their brains. Ogre brains are still up here. So if you shoot an ogre in the head and it somehow manages to pierce his big fat skull, congrats, you killed him. But most of an ogre's vital organs are located in their stomach. So for instance, if you were fighting a human, you would aim, you know, in the chest area to try and hit our heart or our lungs. For an ogre, that's not going to work. You got to aim for the gut. That they're literally all of their vital organs, like their heart, at least a good portion of their lungs, massive amounts of entrails, their stomach, and a surprising amount of just crap is not that kind of crap, is stuffed into their bellies. And that's why ogres usually only bother to wear gut plates, because it is super rare for an attack to kill an ogre without it piercing their gut plate. You have to get hilariously lucky, either hitting them in the eyeball or basically hitting them with such a powerful attack that it just crushes them outright. Let's see. Are the Ogre Kingdoms a part of the old world, or are they considered too far east? They're too far east. The like literal borders of the old world are the eastern edge of the World's Edge Mountains. So kind of up where like Ungrim is and Thorgrim and all those guys. The World's Edge Mountains literally splits that huge continent. You know, the kind of the Eurasia, North Africa situation. It splits all that, you know, from all the way north to all the way south. And that is the border of, that's that particular border of the old world. So the Darklands are not considered part of the old world. Same for the Mountains of Morn and everything else further east. And then how many are left? Okay. Next up is, if the ogres are not considered part of the old world, how often do they fight with the Eastern human empires? So, contrary to what you may think, and I think we kind of talked about this a bit yesterday, the Ogre Kingdoms tend to very rarely go east of the Mountains of Morn, but that's because everything east of them is basically a wasteland until you get to Cathay. The only way to safely get to Cathay is there's a road along the very bottom. There's basically a coastline. If you've played Total War Warhammer since the Deathmaster Snitch and Malice Darkblade DLC, you know, they kind of added all that stuff in the Far East and the Darklands, that coastline with the Dragon Isles and stuff. You basically, there's a road that goes along there, that coastline called, and that's the Silk Road. You have to go that way if you're going to get to Cathay in one piece. Any further north than that, it's not going to happen, because you're going to run into the Ancient Giant Lands. And although it is possible to cross the Ancient Giant Lands, it is super dangerous, because those irradiating warpstone storms are still there and will be there until the sun goes out. So for the Ogre Kingdoms, it's very, very rare for them to fight against the Eastern human kingdoms, just because there are a lot of natural borders between the two of them. That being said, the Ogre Kingdoms do fight with the Kingdoms of End, which is the Warhammer version of India, because they're just to the southeast. There is some geographical stuff blocking the two of them off from each other. So, you know, the southern areas of the Mountains of Morn And the peoples of End are not lazy, and they are not without their defenses, and they have very, very much garrisoned up that particular border. So it's not easy for the ogres to go that way. And for them, it is a much simpler journey with a lot more options for them to go west, which is why they virtually always go west. That being said, it is very, very common and a very important part of ogre culture to go see the Great Maw at least once in your lifetime. It is a profound and horribly deadly and dangerous journey that every ogre is expected to make at least once to follow the footsteps of Groth Onefinger, where you take the journey east to go witness the Great Maw for yourself, to go see their god. But oh boy, is it a dangerous journey. Fun fact, if you actually go to the Black Library website, which you can just Google Black Library, there actually is a short story called The Prophet of the Maw, which is about Groth Onefinger's journey, if you'd like to go read that. The last few... Let's see, let's knock these out. Do ogres have their own special form of magic like the greenskins, and if so, where does it come from? Okay, so we already talked about this earlier. TLDR, the unique lore for the Ogre Kingdoms is just the lore of the Great Maw. Which, what the lore of the Great Maw is the Butchers and Slaughtermasters essentially wield the winds of magic to channel the eternal hunger of their single-minded god, the Great Maw, into what we know as gastromancy. That's probably its most popular side name. The gastromancy is a very simple but direct form of magic that is brought on by acts of cannibalism and very, very gory meal preparation, which is why butchers always are covered in like knives and are constantly preparing people they're eating on the field, or like filleting you when they're fighting you instead of just outright killing you, or they'll be like eating a skull, or they'll have their cauldrons with them and they'll be like pulling stuff out of their pot and eating it. They use those different meals and preparations to channel certain elements of the Great Maw to either empower their allies by physically altering them to make them stronger or tougher, but change something about their physical forms to make them deadlier in combat, or they can use it to channel horrifying agony into their enemies, which you really don't want that. There's a spell called Bonebreaker, not fun. You can imagine what it does. They basically crack into some marrow and you're about to feel all that goodness up in your body, and it's not a good time. Next up, are there female ogres? Yes. And then last, could any ogre or famous ogre characters hold their own against Grim Gore Ironhide? I'm going to be straight with you guys on this one. Ogre characters are very, very scary. They are very, very powerful. Grease's Goldtooth, Golgfag Maneater, and Brag the Gutsman, who are 3 of the 4 ogre characters, and probably even Scrag the Slaughterer, to be honest, they are all exceptionally dangerous opponents who would be able to go toe-to-toe with Grim Gore Ironhide, especially the 3 fighty ones. Golgfag Maneater is a very skilled combatant who has some very dirty tricks and specializes in a lot of very bizarre weaponry and styles of combat. Brag the Gutsman is the legendary executioner among the ogres, who is so deadly that he has learned to literally one-shot ogres. He's got this big old sickle thing. Imagine a sickle, but instead of it ending in just like the Grim Reaper thing, it ends in a chain that goes down to a much bigger sickle that's like a full semicircle. And it was designed to fit an ogre's stomach. So he throws this big old chain at you, and if you're an ogre, it wraps around your gut plate, and then he pulls down and it just slices your stomach right open, and all your guts spill out. And it is considered the worst way to die among ogres. It is literally the most painful possible way for them to die, and Bragg specializes in it. But when fighting non-ogres, he's able to use that big old chain guillotine of his to to just decapitate people, no matter how much armor they're wearing. He is a terrifying opponent. He is someone that if he got lucky, he could totally one-shot Grim Gore. Granted, it would be a lucky shot, but he would be a very worthy opponent for Grim Gore. And of course, Grease's Goldtooth was an absurdly good opponent for Grim Gore Ironhide. We get a lot more into it in a later day of questions, but the Grim Gore beating Greases was not an easy thing for Grim Gore. That wasn't like that wasn't a WWE SmackDown where there was no chance. Grim Gore had to rely on some really bizarre tactics, like dropping Gitsnick and not using it so he could try and wrestle Greases for his own weapon, because Greases was gonna kick his ass. So, granted, Grim Gore did win that fight, but it was a hell of a fight. So that's gonna be it for today's questions. I went way over time, but I'm sure none of you are gonna mind. Thank you all so much for joining me. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I will be back this weekend with some other stuff, but if you're waiting for just Ogre Kingdom's Q&A stuff, then we will be back to your regularly scheduled lore content on Monday at 7 a.m. So, yeah. Thanks for watching, guys. Wash your hands. Bye.